I would like to show you another very exciting game played in the Superbet Rapid tournament in Warsaw. The last couple of days we have been covering some very exciting games from Magnus Carlsen, but there are so many other strong players involved in this event. And since the tournament is played in Warsaw in Poland, I thought it would make a lot of sense to have a look at the game between the two Polish players in the field, Jan Krzysztof Duda and Radosław Wojtaszek, number 1 and 2 of their country, facing each other in the 5th round of the Superbet Rapid tournament. Let's have a look what happened. Jan Krzysztof Duda opened here with the move 1d4, and after knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, Wojtaszek goes for the very solid line, bishop b4, the Nimzo Indian, e3, the so-called Rubinstein variation, and the line we get to see is actually very popular nowadays. Black castles, bishop d3, d5, and now white decides to fix the pawn formation in the center by taking on d5. C takes d5, e takes d5. Well, looks as if it's a very kind of standard position which could also arise from, for instance, the Queen's Gambit declined. But here the bishop is still on c1. In the Queen's Gambit, it's very often on g5 or on f4. It's somewhat more actively placed. But here the bishop is still on c1, and it brings some different dynamics with it. White decides to go for the move a3, questioning the bishop on b4. And black, of course, can take on c3, but since the position is still kind of half open, potentially white's bishops are going to be quite powerful. There's no need giving up the bishop pair yet. Black decides to drop back with his bishop to d6. That's the most active square. You could also think, let's drop back to e7, but normally you go back to e7 trying to unpin the knight in case white has a bishop on g5. But since that's not the case, makes a lot of sense having the bishop on a more active diagonal. White goes for queen c2. And now knight a6. Remarkable move, but still well-known theory. The knight looks a bit odd on a6. What is it going to do there? Well, the plan is to break very quickly with a move c5, or otherwise maybe play c6, and then later on the knight could even come back via c7 to e6. What you have to realize is that you don't have to be concerned about bishop takes a6, b takes a6. Looks as if these doubled pawns are really ugly, but white is missing its most powerful piece. The bishop on d3 is actually a really important piece, covering the light squares, exerting pressure on black's king. But now the bishop is no longer there. The remaining bishop on c1 isn't that great, and black has a lot of ideas to try to activate both its bishops. So c5 is a typical plan, but also a5 followed by bishop a6. Trying to take over control over the light squares is a very sensible idea. For that reason, white decided not to take the knight on a6, played knight f3, black goes rook e8, and now white goes b4, trying to expand on the queen side, showing that the knight may look a bit strange. It will be difficult to get in c5, but black goes for the move c6. And now, I think if I would give this position to any amateur player, maybe a titled player, I think everybody would go here for the move castling kingside. I think it's a very natural way of continuing with your development. Jan Krzysztof Duda, top 10 player in the world, decides differently and thinks, well, let's go here with a knight to e5. And that's at least a very remarkable decision, because you're putting the knight on a square where it's protected only once, but it can be taken twice by both the bishop and rook. So what is the idea? Well, in the game, there followed bishop takes e5, d takes e5, rook takes e5. Black is a pawn up, but after bishop b2, obviously this bishop can potentially become very strong. Together with the other pieces, they are all together able to exert pressure against black's king side. But let's go back 1 second, because here was a remarkable moment which both players overlooked. You would think bishop takes e5 is the principled move. White would love to follow up here with f4, given a chance. But here it's black to play. And the best move in the position now is the remarkable move c5. Look, what's the idea? You're trying to undermine that knight on e5. So white can never take with the d-pawn, because the d-pawn needs to keep the knight protected. If you do take on c5, then the idea is to take with a knight on c5, and the knight is about to join play, ready to take off the bishop on d3, and well, d takes c5 can be met by bishop takes e5 with an excellent game for black. So interesting moment, both sides didn't play accurately in the early stage of the game, but still, black is a pawn up, and it's going to be very interesting how play is going to evolve in the next couple of moves. So after bishop b2, the idea is that black is unable to break in the center with d4, which is the move you would love to play, but then there is the move knight e2, and there's no chance for black to take on e3, because if you do so, the rook is hanging on e5. So d4 doesn't work, but very logical move could be just to go back with a knight, and then possibly later move the rook back as well. You're a pawn up and you try to consolidate your position, enjoy the material plus. But in the game, Wojtaszek played aggressively, played the move bishop g4, white goes h3, and now after bishop h5, white decided to go knight e2 with the idea to hit the rook, and the rook goes back to e8, and now, well, you see there's a bit of pressure with the bishops. You may take on f6, but after queen takes f6, also the rook on a1 can be taken later, so you don't really want to take immediately on f6. But white had a different plan. Played here the move bishop takes a6. So still this move was played, ruining the pawn structure, and you could take the pawn on c6. But if you do that right away with queen takes c6, then there's bishop takes e2, and well, you don't really want to stay with your king in the center. For instance, if you do recapture with your king now, then all of a sudden black goes knight e4 and will develop a really dangerous initiative against the white king with moves like queen g5, rook c8. The rook hits the queen, intends to come into white's position very quickly. And if you're not careful, let me show you one line. Let's say you go rook c1, I will go queen g5, hitting the pawn. If you protect the pawn, knight takes f2. The tables are turned around here. If king takes f2, it's queen takes e3, and white is getting checkmated. So you see the dangers also of white's strategy to keep the king in the center. But Duda had seen all of this probably and thought, let's first move the knight away to hit the bishop. The bishop goes back to g6, attacks the queen on c2, and only now white captures the pawn on c6. So material is even again, but still the white king is still on e1, and therefore the move d4 is played. That's a very important resource with the idea that the king is in the center, and if you take with the bishop, well, there is still queen takes d4, and you cannot take the queen because of the pin along the e-file. White played here the move rook d1. It's by far the best move in the position. So now it's the white rook opposing the black queen on the d-file. A lot of tactics in this very interesting game. Black goes rook c8, attacking the queen on c6. But of course the queen gotta go away and decides, let's take a pawn on a6, a useful pawn. And now the idea is that the queen of black can leave the d-file with queen c7. Very interesting moment, because the idea is very clear. You would like to take on f4. And for that reason, Duda decided to take with the rook on d4 to keep the knight protected. But that's not the best move, as we will get to see, because all of a sudden the black queen will seriously consider entering white's position, hitting the bishop on b2 as well. You could have taken instead here with the move bishop takes d4, and this was overlooked by both players. What is the problem? Well, there is queen takes f4, and it looks as if you are winning a piece as black. But can you see what is the key move here for for white? White to play, and how to refute black's last move? Well, there is queen takes c8, beautiful deflection motive, with the point that if you do take with the rook is no longer pinning the pawn on e3, and white has e takes f4. That means the queen will have to move away, but after, let's say, queen c7, queen takes g2, it's still a bit of a mess, but white is an exchange and a pawn up and should be able to convert this. Was not played in the game. Let's see what happened there. Rook takes d4. Don't forget, it's a rapid game. The players don't have the time to work out all these lines. But of course they see some tactics, but they can also make some mistakes with this shorter time control. Black goes queen c2, hitting the bishop on b2. So white is 2 pawns up, but he has to be very careful, because if you try to defend the bishop with your rook, there's queen b1 check, and it's a skewer on the back rank. You got to block with your rook, but then there's queen takes b2. It's game over. If you don't block with your rook, well, the rook on h1 is lost. Therefore, queen e2 played. And of course, white would love to exchange queens, because more pieces are getting exchanged. We are getting closer to an endgame, and the extra pawns are going to be decisive. And now the big difference with the move rook d2 we have seen is that in case of queen b1, now there is the move rook d1, attacking the queen while the queen covers the bishop on b2. But Wojtaszek keeps the game going with a very interesting move. He doesn't mind exchanging queens, but he decides under which circumstances. He comes in with the knight to e4. That's an excellent move, because all of a sudden you see that white has difficulties to release the tension. If you do take on c2, the rook enters, hitting the bishop, and the pawn on f2 can be taken as well. Well, the big problem is what to do with the bishop. If the bishop goes away, is rook c1 check? Again, it's this skewer. White's king is in the center, and if you go rook d1, we can take everything and take on f2. So many nice little tactics. Queen takes c2, it's not possible. But about, if you castle here, there is queen takes e2, knight takes e2, and rook c2, and you're winning a piece as well. Therefore, white decided to drop back with the rook to d1, try to consolidate the back rank. But this is a critical moment in which Wojtaszek made a serious mistake, in fact, because he decided to go queen b3. Very human decision, trying to get the rook into c2, hitting the queen and the bishop. Should be said, though, that with a move like bishop h5, very difficult move to find, he could have put white still under a lot of pressure. You're attacking the queen. If the queen takes the bishop, it's going to be checkmate on f2. That's game over. That's one of the ideas of having the knight on e4, trying to force the queen to go away. If you take with the knight on h5, it's queen takes e2, king takes e2, rook c2, and you're winning back some part of your material, and you're really, really active, which does compensate the two minus pawns. Still, a lot of other possibilities. White could block with f3 or g4, but the game continues in that case. After Wojtaszek's choice, queen b3, white is able to evacuate its king. He decided to castle. There is rook c2, hitting the queen and the bishop, but then there is queen b5. That's the way out here for white, because the point is that the bishop cannot be taken because of queen takes e8, and it's checkmate. White is attacking the rook, therefore the rook got to move away. Rook f8 played, but now the bishop finds a stable spot on d4, and white is 2 pawns up, but black is still fighting. Look what happens. Rook takes f2. The tactics are not over yet, with the idea that if you take on f2, it's queen takes d1, which was in fact played in the game. However, there are a lot of tactical ideas, and if white would have been very precise, he could just have taken first the bishop on g6. The idea is that after h takes g6, you're able to come with your queen to e5, threatening checkmate on g7, hitting the knight on e4. If you do take on f1, it's rook takes f1. The knight is still a problem. If you block with knight f6, it's rook takes f6, g takes f6, queen takes f6, and there's nothing you can do against the mating threat on g7. Was not played in the game. There followed rook takes f2 immediately, but now after queen takes d1, rook f1, the queen comes back to c2, and this makes a huge difference. Why? Because this queen is protecting the knight on e4. White has a lot of options, decided to simplify with knight takes g6, which leads to similar play as what we just have seen, but there's a big difference. However, the pawn on a7 could also just have been taken, and it looks as if white is technically winning in that case, although you always got to be alert. White's king is a bit open, there's a knight and a queen. There are always tactical ideas for black as well. But after knight takes g6, h takes g6, queen e5, you see that you don't have to move your knight away, because the queen covers the knight on e4. So knight f6 would once again be a huge blunder, leading to the same tactic we have seen already. But instead, f6 is the way to fight back you're preventing the mating threat, and you're attacking the queen at the same time. Queen d5 played with check, king h7, and, well, white is a pawn up, but things are far from simple. As long as there's a knight and a queen, you always got to reckon with potential counterplay. White decided to slightly improve its own king. There were other ways of playing here as well. Maybe something like rook f4 could have been considered. But king h2 is also a very logical move. But there followed g5, very good move, so that you never have to worry about rook f4 ideas. So the knight stays on e4. It's a very unpleasant piece for white to deal with. White goes queen d7 with ideas also to give potentially a check, for instance. But you don't want to stay in the same line as the queen along the 7th. So you move your king to h6. This is a very technical, good move, anticipating a potential check on f5. And now it's still very tricky because white could, for instance, take the pawn on a7. But what I would like to show you with this example is that it's still very tricky with the strongest pieces still on the board. It doesn't matter you are 2 pawns up, because here there could follow queen c4, hitting the rook on f1, unprotected piece. If white does something about the rook, let's say it goes away somewhere, you have rook f7 with an attack on the queen, setting up a skewer along the 7th. So you got to be very careful, and when you have a material plus, it does make a lot of sense. Try to secure your pieces. Rook f5 was played in the game, but things are far from simple. Even a move like king g6, you can just question what are you doing here with your rook. It's not clear to me what the rook is exactly doing, but probably the players were getting lower on time. Here they followed rook c8, so black is trying to find a way to infiltrate with its own rook somehow. Let's say the queen goes away, and if the rook comes in, maybe you can set up mating threats against the pawn on g2. For that reason, white thought, let's now offer the exchange of rooks. Very clever idea, because if you do take with a knight, there is queen takes c8 and the knight is pinned. This is winning for white, so you cannot take with the knight on c5. But after rook takes c5, b takes c5, all of a sudden we get to see that the white rook is missing in defense. So if the rook would have still been on the f-file somewhere, black's next move, queen f2, would not have been possible. Now the queen and knight are nicely working together, and the fact that white does have an extra passed pawn doesn't matter at all. If you go c6, at least black would have a perpetual check, repetition of moves, there's no way out for the white king. Therefore, white decided to play here the move queen g4. The queen is back in defense, but no longer able to support the pawn on c5. So you're covering this square, but here there is the move knight d2, and look what the knight is doing. It's on its way to f1. And all of a sudden you get to see that if knight f1 can be played, there is a check, the king got to go away. For instance, if you would play c6, there is knight f1, king h1, and you can go knight g3, and at least you have a repetition again. For that reason, white was trying to play for a win, obviously, played here the move h4. But still, what about knight f1? Could still have been played. White's idea, of course, is that king h3 can now be played. But there is queen g1. Look at the way black's pieces are nicely working together. Queen h2 or queen h1 is a big threat. You gotta take on g5, but after f takes g5, you still have to be very careful. If you go g3, it's still mate. Probably you got to sack your bishop. And then after the king goes away, you could take immediately the bishop. But after queen e6, king takes g7, you capture the bishop anyway. I think white has nothing better than just settling for a repetition of moves. It's a perpetual. But for some reason, Wojtaszek thought that he doesn't have to play knight f1. He thought, let me take the pawn on h4, and it's a nice extra pawn, and I still have these ideas based on knight f1. But he completely overlooked white's next move, as there is this move queen f4. Look, if we take this move, if we go back 2 moves, you understand that with the pawn on g5, you're trying to remove a very important defender of the black king. And after g takes h4, it's queen f4, you do force the exchange of queens, and black has to go for it. Take on f4, the knight comes back to e4, but now the c pawn is really strong. It's really about to be pushed. You're threatening to take the pawn on a7 as well. Black thought, let's just play a6 and I'm still in time to come back with my knight. Hopefully the king can come over and maybe there are still drawing chances. So c7 would not have been the best move here. Black is still fighting in that case. But can you see here the killer blow, the final move of the game, which ensured victory for young Christoph Duda. It is white to play and win. And I help you. You should try to prevent this move, knight d6. And you can do that with the move bishop c5, and black resigned. Incredible shot, because this bishop is preventing the knight from getting back to d6 so that it can cover the c pawn. If you do take the bishop, the main point there is c7, and all of a sudden the c pawn is unstoppable. Obviously you don't have to take the bishop, but in that case, let's say you bring your king, it's c7 and the pawn cannot be stopped either. I thought this was a very fascinating game with a lot of tactical ideas and missed opportunities by both players, but for that reason also very instructive. So I hope you liked this video. If so, please give it a like. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more fascinating games covered here. Thanks for watching and see you soon again. Bye bye.